Hi, I'm Dave Groark. I used to fly this old airplane, one of the best airplanes you could ever fly in the world. Every pilot in Tactical Air Command when I was there wanted to fly the F-104. And they didn't have a whole lot of them, so you were considered pretty lucky if you got to fly one. I flew C models and D models, which were Tactical Air Command at George Air Force Base for several years. Actually rotated, took them down to Boca Chica Naval Air Station in Florida for the Cuban crisis. That's an interesting flight that we took down there. Flew them over to Germany for the Berlin crisis when the wall went up. That was a lot of fun. Later on in my career, I went to Edwards to the Aerospace Research Pilot School out there, and we flew F-104As and F-104Bs. The A's and the C's were the single-seat models. The B's and the D's were the two-seat versions. There was also a German version called of the F-104G. The Europeans flew a lot, and the Japanese had a version, and the Italians had a version. A lot of 104s were sent around the world. Great airplane, great airplane. Let's tell you a little bit about it as we walk around here. I'm not going to crawl under there, but you check, and you're going to do your pre-flight. You check under there, make sure all the pins are out in the nose gear and everything's good. The C model, the nose gear retracted up, and the D model, the nose gear retracted down. So taking off in a C, you didn't want to wait too long till you got your climb established and got that gear coming up, because you're increasing the forces that it has to go against if you don't. One of the things that made this a really light airplane was the arrangement that they had with the canopy. It was a very easy canopy. You opened it up crossways like this and it would open. And in the C models, there were two nozzles that here the canopy came down and rested on. And when you went to eject and you pulled the ejection, you could either pull up your handles and fire the triggers, or you did like the Navy uses. They had a center section. But you pulled the handles up. There was a knee brace that came in on the sides. And now one of the neat things about the 104 was all the pilots in 104s wore Spurs. They were called Spurs that went on your heels, and they were little round things that you could lock into a ball in the airplane. And you would stand up and you would lock these things in like this, and they were on cables. But the cables were very loose. You didn't even know you were using them. You could move your feet around, and everything was really great like that with the cables. And when you ejected, the thrusters, they would take the rail out of the side of the canopy, and the thrusters would push the canopy up just enough for the airflow to get it, and the airflow would take it off, and then you'd go shooting out. There was a roller thing that would take your feet and roll up the cables and snap them back into the back of the seat so they didn't flail. And as you went up the canopy rails, you reached a certain point where you actuated a device that would actually cut those cables for you, so you weren't trapped in the seat with the cables on the thing. And as you went further up, it would throw you out of the seat with what they called a butt snapper that went through there. Had a couple Italians training at George Air Force Base one day. They were in the airplane, or one of them was, at the end of the runway. And somehow or other, somebody mentioned or said, fire this or fire that, and one of these guys thought that they were telling him that his airplane was on fire. So he jumped up in the seat and he dove over the side of the airplane to get out, but he didn't undo his spurs, and he got about this far and he caught, and it banged him against the side of the airplane, broke both arms. So you wanted to undo your spurs before you got out. But the nice thing about the Spurs were they were metal, and if you walked on a tile floor or any kind of floor, they would click. And the real good thing too was to wear your G-suit. You got your Spurs on. We had our Spurs. We took them down and had them chromed. We had chrome Spurs polished up, and they were great. And you'd walk into base ops and you'd be clicking these heels. Everybody would look around to what was going on over there. It would be the 104 guys just walking in, clicking their heels. In the early days, to set a record, a guy named Scrappy Johnson took one of these airplanes, so we had to show how good it was, from the end of the runway to 103,000 feet. In a stock airplane, now they didn't load it up, it was very light and everything, but they got this plane up to 103,000 feet, and that's pretty good. When we took them to Germany during the Berlin crisis, one of the things that a couple of the guys got to do, and then the Air Force made us stop doing it, we would go out and get in the airplane, take the airplane and run towards the East German border. And of course, the East Germans would scramble some airplanes because they had to meet these guys coming towards the border. And we tried to do it in not so good weather because the East Germans weren't really good weather pilots. And they would take off to try and catch us and come at us, and they crashed a few trying to recover. But we would go up to close to the border and then turn and then run along the border and zoom the airplane up. At those days, the pressure suit was the ones that had it look like Flash Gordon with cap stands up the side, and you walked like this in it, and you had a helmet, you had to pull the chin strap down to keep your head down so you could see. They weren't really that good. I had a friend of mine who zoomed it, and he got it to about 70,000 feet and got into a spin. Fortunately for him, it took him down to about 30,000 feet before he was able to recover, but he did pull the airplane. Now, that may be the reason they stopped us doing it too, because we were a bunch of amateurs zooming airplanes up like that. But that was a lot of fun. When I got to Edwards, flying the models out there, we did zoom flights to get used to re-entry and if you were coming in the lifting body or one of those other airplanes. But at that time, we had the full pressure suits, and they were really easy to fly with. You put those things on, just like you see in the newsreels or when they're going out to run the shuttle. That's what we wore in these to go up there. You would go up to about 38,000 feet, and you wanted to get what we called as much smash as you can get. You want to get as fast as you can get, because one thing about fighter pilots, they are just totally all competitive. No matter what you do, I can do it better. So the idea was, who could get this airplane up the highest? Well, the front end of this compressor is made of magnesium, and you can only take it up and get it so hot, and then you're going to cause a compressor stall in this airplane. And you had two instruments in the cockpit that you could look at to do that. One was called a CIT, compressor inlet temperature gauge, and you could take that up to 100 degrees. Well, I don't know if it was real degrees, but it went up to 100 on there, and that's where you had to quit. To make sure that you knew that, you noticed that there was a little light that sat right up here that would blink, and it said slow, 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 and it's saying slow down, you're getting too much. Well, they would brief us at Edwards. They say, take it out to about Mach 2. When you get to Mach 2, go ahead and zoom it, because you don't want to go too far. Well, I had a friend that went too far in it one time, even before that, and when you get up there so far that it's overheating, you get a tremendous compressor stall, and if your seatbelt isn't fastened, you're going to find yourself sitting way up in the front of that thing, and you got to climb back into the cockpit, because when it stalls at Mach 2, it gives you a pretty good bang. So we knew that you could get up to at least 100 degrees and the slow light, and it was somewhere around 2.1, but we wanted to get as high as we could get. So we just keep pushing that thing, and you're watching it, the light's blinking, the gauge is up over 100, and you're watching the Mach meter, and you're 2.2, 2.25, 2.26. And now you have a test of nerve. How far can I push this before I get a big bang and I'm going to get stuck in this, or where should I go? Well, I hit a little under Mach 2.3 and pulled back and zoomed the thing up. And as you're coming up, you got to you dump your cabin pressure. You did that at 30,000 feet, so you're not pressurized inside. As you go through about 70,000 feet, you've got to come out of afterburner, or you're going to over-temp the turbine. As you go through 80-some thousand feet, you got to shut the engine down. Now, that's the first and only time in a single-seat fighter that I've ever intentionally shut down the engine. But you got to shut the engine down, and at that point, you're just totally ballistic, and you're just riding the airplane, looking out at everything, and you can see the Earth curve, you can see the black, and you come over the top, and then you start back down, and then your only concern is, okay, now is this thing going to start again when I get back down there? But I got the airplane to 92,000 feet. That was really enjoyed that. It was a fun flight, and I was there for maybe 4 or 5 seconds until you're coming back down. Fortunately, the airplane started up, came back in, and landed it. It was a very good flight. Great airplane. The only real problems that I can recall that I had, or that we had while I was flying the airplane, we came to a point where we had some problems with the fuel controls. For no reason at all, the main fuel control was shut down, cut the fuel to the engine, and of course the engine would quit running. Now, if you were up high enough and you could get a restart, that wasn't a real serious problem. You could get it restarted and you could come back. We had one serious incident at George Air Force Base. My ops officer was coming in to land, and he had just pitched out, was coming around and starting to make his base turn, and the fuel control shut down on him, and he lost his engine. Well, he thought he would be able to make the runway with the airplane, even with the engine out. But with the engine out, with no trailing edge flaps being blown, no boundary layer control, this thing sinks like a rock. And unfortunately, he hit short of the runway by around 5 or 6 feet and killed himself in the thing. So we had some serious problems until we got that fixed. But we had about 3 or 4 cases, I think, where people had the fuel control just shut down on them. Most of them were not in such a critical position that they had to, that they came in with the airplane. And they went around and did some mathematics on it afterwards, and they figured that once the engine shut down when he was in that turn, if he did not punch out immediately, regardless, he was never going to make it. So it was unfortunate. Supersonic intake. This did not have any variable parts, and the variable parts were in the engine. In the stator blades, they had variable stator blades. But this thing would go out to well over Mach 2. You could get it to Mach 2.2, 2.3 without any real problem, if you had the fuel to do it. Check down the intakes. The one thing that you wanted to be careful of coming around was this edge of this wing. This thing, they say, is razor sharp. It's not quite that sharp, but it is sharp. Wings into the fuselage is 7.5 feet. It's about a 4-inch thick at the fuselage and 2-inch thick at the tip. I was at Barksdale Air Force Base taking an airplane out of there one time, and the crew chief ran under to get the chocks out of the wheels, and we had told him to be careful, that he hit his head right here, and he took around 12 stitches to stitch up when they finally took him in to do that. He was bleeding like a stuck pig out there. So usually they have a cut. If it takes it on an air show or a display, they put little things like this on the wing here to keep it so somebody doesn't walk into it. This was one of 2 Air Force airplanes that had what is called a T-tail, as you can see high on the top up there. It was real. We had no real problems with it, except if you got the airplane into a high angle of attack, you blanked out the tail. And if you blanked out the tail, and they had the same problem with the F-101, which had the T-tail, then the airplane could go into a pitch-up, and it could actually do somersaults in there, and you lost control of it. And almost all cases I know of, and not that many, of where someone lost control, they had to bail out of it because they couldn't recover the airplane. But you had in the cockpit, you had a little indicator that told you your angle. If it wasn't your true angle of attack, there were some transducers on the side of the airplane, angle of attack indicators. And it went up from 0 to 5. And when it hit about 4.5, then the stick would start shaking. If you were flying along and you were doing some air combat maneuvering or something, or flying other guys, and the stick starts shaking, you know you're getting awful close to where you're going to pitch this thing up. When you finally hit 5 on the thing, the stick would bang. It would have what they called a stick kicker. It would kick the stick forward. And it wouldn't take it out of your hand, but it would pull your arm forward, and that said, you better stop or you're going to get into a somersault here very quickly with this thing. So that's the warning that they put on it, which was very good. And when we would fly them and we would come in and pitch out, we would try and do the pitch out, because fighter pilots always want to make a tight turn. They want to make a tight pitch out and a tight turn coming down and land. And so you would try and pitch out and bring the stick just to the point where you held it on the edge of shaker, where it was shaking, because you couldn't get any more off than that. I went to Edwards to fly when we were flying the 104 there, and of course they were checking everybody in the class out. It was a very short checkout, so it wasn't real thorough. And the pilots out there did not come from F-104. I mean, they were the guys that did all that. So they were very cautious about this, and they should be, because we're training bomber pilots and cargo pilots to fly these things out there. But we would take it and we would pitch out and we'd bring it right back to shaker and do it. And on more than one occasion, when I had a two-seater with an instructor in the back seat, scared the devil out of me when I would pull that thing and the stick would start, push it forward. So it was just a matter of whether you had experience in the airplane or not. If you had a lot of experience, you'd pull it back to shaker. If you didn't, you'd just do maybe an F-100 type pattern. I don't know. Normally, when you flew this thing clean, you had about a little under 6,000 pounds of fuel in the aircraft. With the tip tanks, there were another little over 1,000 pounds in each one. Without the tip tanks and flying this thing clean, you weren't going to go too far. It didn't have a whole lot of range, but it sure had speed and height. You could take this bird up to 40,000 feet in under 2 minutes from the standing start on the runway. So it's a fast little airplane. It has leading edge and trailing edge flaps. The leading edge flaps we call maneuvering flaps, and they could be used if you were hassling and fighting and you wanted to drop them. You could actually get one more G on the airplane if you had your maneuvering flaps down, but you did have some airspeed restrictions on it. The trailing edge flaps were, and back here, were actually blown. They had boundary layer control on it, come off the compressor of the engine and would blow air over the flaps when they came down. You need a little bit of extra lift when you're going slow. We would come down we would turn final at about 185 knots and then slowly bleed the speed off and touch down at about 155. So you touch down in a real reasonable speed range at that. But you didn't want to lose asymmetrical air over these flaps, or you'd get into a little roll situation if you lost your boundary layer control. You could fly it, you could land it and fly it without that, but you're going to have to come in a little bit faster. Back here where we can't drop it, there was a hydraulic panel that you drop down. It's very convenient, because this is a great airplane to fix and fly, because everything was so conveniently located in it. It was so small. All of your hydraulic pressures, your oil back here, you could test and check all back here, and made it real easy on the pre-flight. The tail hook was added a little bit later. They had some problems with gear barrier arrestments in this airplane when it came out, and they ran the barrier tests, and that was the old barrier that would stand up the webbing and everything it would catch. And it would catch in the gear, and it would catch on the doors, and sometimes it would stop the airplanes, and sometimes it would turn them around at the other end, and the airplane would actually roll over and with them there. So they went to a tail hook, and that made it much easier to stop this airplane if you had to go into the overrun. Drag chute. The drag chute was really neat, easy to do. You could pack it up yourself. The door came down, the chute came out, and stopped the airplane. If you weren't at a base where they could repack it, you could actually take that chute, hook it back up again, stuff it all in there, and put the door up. And they said the chances were it would work if you dropped the door again. If it came out and the wind caught it, it would work for you. But it was a real good, easy airplane to maintain and to go on cross country with, because everything was so central. Tell you something about in the days. One of the things that TAC and the Air Force said is, if you have runway, you use it all. You don't try and do anything else and turn off. You go to the end of the runway before you do that. Well, we had two guys coming into Myrtle Beach one day, and at the old Myrtle Beach Air Force Base, there's a taxiway that comes off from the very center of the runway, and I don't forget the length of the runway, probably 8,500 feet or something. Anyway, you land and you go to the end and you have to taxi all the way back. Well, the guy in the #1 airplane was sort of a smart aleck anyway, so he goes down and he lands and he touches down and he calls up to the tower, says, "Tower, can I turn off at midfield here?" And the tower said, "Yeah, it's okay, you can do that." And the second guy is coming in and thinks, "Well, that son of a gun, how do you get that slowed down so slow and get back to where he could turn? If he can do it, I can do it." And this guy comes in and lands and he's hitting the brakes and he wants to turn off there and he's trying to make the turn off and he blows both tires on the airplane. And when he looks up, here comes #1 who's taxiing up from the far end, coming all the way up. He made the call, but he had no intention of turning off there, so he screwed up his #2 guy who tried to turn off and blew his tires. Great afterburner on this engine. It came in stages. You had a little over 15,000 pounds of thrust in full afterburner and 10,000 pounds of thrust without afterburner. It's interesting in that you could actually get the airplane when you were if you had no tip tanks and nothing else on it, you could actually get it down below 14,000 pounds or just around the 14,000 pound mark. So with that, of course, you were probably maybe 400 pounds of fuel left, not much. So in theory, with 15,000 pounds of thrust and a 14,000 pound airplane, you could stand it on the tail and just go straight up. Of course, you had to use the burner to do that. And once you lit the burner at that low in fuel, you were probably going to have to glide in after all. IT tail. That was one of the reasons, the tail and the way it works aerodynamically, was one of the reasons the wings that you see are drooped down like this. That's called negative dihedral on the wings, and they have a 10-degree negative dihedral. And in combination with the high T tail, that made for lateral stability of the airplane. Most airplanes' wings are either up or even, and that's what gives the airplane stability around the lateral axis. They needed to put these down to compensate for the tail and the shortness of the wing in order to get the lateral stability in the airplane that they needed. Speed brakes, one on each side, very effective. Came out from there, hit a switch, and there they are. Now refueling, originally on these models, they did not have single point refueling. Everything was refueled over the top. You had a main tank and aft and some aft tanks, side, right, left, and center aft tanks, and a main fuel tank. And the C model had a little auxiliary tank that was up a little further, and they could be fueled over the top, which was the way to do it. Once they went to the air refueling probe and put an air refueling capability into the airplane, well, then you also had a center point where you could hook up and refuel the airplane from a single point. Interesting things about the gun. This is the gun port that comes out. When the gun fires, the shells and the lengths are all ejected downward out of the airplane. You don't save them. This was the M60 One Gatling Gun, 6 barrels. The Gatling gun itself could fire 6,000 rounds a minute, and when you think about that, that's 100 rounds a second. That's pretty fast. These guns that we flew in the 104 were set down to fire only 4,000 rounds a minute. And a reason for that is, when they did the original test in 1955, Tony LeVere did the firing tests, supersonic firing tests of the airplane. On his second pass at 1.2 or something, I'm not sure exactly, Mach, the airplane everything quit. The airplane shut down, it flamed out. He couldn't get it started again. He ended up having to dead stick it into Edwards Dry Lake out at Edwards, where he was. And they went over and they found out that one of the shells had ejected backwards and went through the gun compartment, and that's what caused his flame out and all that. Well, about less than a year later, Fish Salmon was up flying the gun check again, and when he burst the gun, it blew the bottom panel off from below the airplane, and he couldn't. It put it into a spin. He could not recover from it, so he had to eject when they lost the airplane. He was okay, but they figured out after that the gases were building up back in here, and when they got to a certain point, they blew up and blew the panels off and everything, which they fixed. But it's why they went down to setting the gun here for only 4,000 rounds a minute instead of 6,000 rounds a minute. It was a great gun, really wonderful gun to fire, very accurate. The seat in the original airplanes, the seat was a downward ejecting seat. That wasn't really such a great idea because you didn't have much low altitude bailout capability. When they went to the upward ejection seat, and you could bail out at 0 altitude as long as you had 120 knots airspeed, or you were in level flight with it. You could get a good chute from that. Not so much in a dive. I had and I don't know. I met the guy. I used to fly with this guy in my squadron, who claimed to be, and I'm sure he was, the survivor of the lowest bailout from an F-104 using a downward seat. And this was over in Spain. We used to deploy from George Air Force Base to Spain, and I was not on that deployment that he was on. He had a problem with the airplane over there, and ended coming up down and realized he was going to have to get out of it, and they still had the downward seat. He went out at about 700 feet, came down, the chute started to stream, never got billowed out totally, was streaming behind him, and he came down and crashed through a greenhouse over in Spain where there were a lot of pines and trees they were growing, I don't know what, but it was a pretty soft landing. He came crashing through there, and he actually got up, picked up the chute, folded it up, and walked away. The story is he took it back to the personal equipment people, gave him the chute, and looked at him and said, "It didn't work."